What we're going to look at now is the host controller. When it comes to configuring a host controller, I'm looking at typically the host XML file that is actually basically required by the host controller. Now the host controller, whenever you're starting a host controller, it's combining a domain XML file and the host XML file. That's what it actually uses. So if it's actually acting as the master node or the domain controller, we'll actually use the domain XML file and the host XML file. But if it's the slave controller, will use the host XML file, and then the domain information will connect to the domain controller and then pull all the domain XML information from the domain controller. So it's not going to use the domain XML file part of where it's running, rather it's connect to the domain controller and pull all the configuration information from there. So every controller by default, when it's starting up, it's combining the domain XML, host XML. Only the domain controller uses the domain and host XML combination. Every other controller, it actually basically uses the host XML file wherever it's running, and then the rest of the domain XML information and pull it from the domain controller. Keep that in mind. So let's take a look at the host XML file. The host XML file will contain a host name attribute here on the top. You can able to label each one of the hosts. So when it kind of registered, or when you go into the management console, you can actually identify each host with a specific name. And then as the start of the tag, and here's the end of the host tag. Things that you can typically find in a host XML file is the system properties that you want to define, anything that you want to define part of your need for your environment, and then any file system path if you want to specify. Vault for storing any encrypted password, part of the security domain section, we'll talk about that. And then pretty much the management section identify the management interface and the security settings for the management interface. The domain controller is an important tag we talked about in the previous section of this unit, which will actually specify whether something acts as a master controller or domain controller, or will act as a slave controller. That's the domain controller tag. And then you have the interfaces, the actual interface definition you will find there, and then also any JVM definitions, and then you'll find the server definition. So let's take a look at an example here. So I have a host slave XML file that I have here. This is actually part of a lab coming up. You will actually have a machine 1 will act as the domain controller or the master controller. The machine 2 will act as the host slave controller on a host 2. So in the machine 2, the domain folder under the configuration directory, I'm just basically looking at this host slave XML file. That's what I'm looking at here. So it has a management section defining the security realm for the management and also the application realms, and defining the management interface using the native. And then domain controller, which is actually the important part here. Since it's a slave controller, it's actually using the remote tag connecting to the domain controller host using this property, JBoss domain master address, and port JBoss master.port 999. So when it comes to starting the host controller, the slave controller for example, I have a host2.sh. If you take a look at the script here, again we use the domain.sh script to starting the master controller or any slave controller, and then --host config. Here I'm using the host slave XML file here, and then basically the configuration directory here, the domain based directory, is actually part of the opt machine 2. That's assuming that we are having it running on a separate machine, but here we all have it in a separate folder here. And then also the very important part here, -D JBoss domain master address equal to, and then specify the IP address where the master is running. So if you look at the host master.sh for a previous section, we actually look at starting the domain controller, simply domain.sh host config, use the host master XML file, and then location of the configuration. That's all we need to specify. Here when we're starting the host slave XML or host slave controllers, you need to specify the --host config, a slave configuration XML file, and also the location of the directory, the domain based directory. On top of that, this particular property here, the JBoss domain master address, and the port, assuming if it's a default port 999, that's actually being assumed here. So then you don't have to specify that part of the startup script. In the case that's different for your domain, then you need to specify that information also. So all we specify here, JBoss domain master address and that particular IP address. Now the other information you'll find in the host XML file, host controller XML file, is the interface definitions, the concrete definition of the interfaces, the management, which particular IP address the management interface will listen on, and for the public address for any kind of application access, which interface they will listen on, and then for unsecure, if you have a thick client, which interface will listen on. That actually will be defined here. And also followed by any JVM definition, so part of the JVM section, any named JVM like default. So whenever you start any number of servers within this host, by default uses these settings for each one of the EAP6 instance. So here's a heap size, min heap size, max heap size, the permanent generation size, which is where the class get loaded, all the classes. Here's where's your object get created in Java. And then any kind of Java option you can able to specify here. So I have one JVM name default here, another JVM name called host2 JVM. Basically I'm labeling this particular host slave, this particular host as host2. So you can able to identify in the console as host2, for example. As you can notice here, host2, you can identify as host2. So let's take a look at in the host XML file, the other important thing that you will find is the server. Pretty much servers are defined in the host XML file, part of the host controller that actually manages the server. So here's actually a one server definition, which is happen to be a dev server 1, belong to a group, dev server 1 belong to a group, dev group here. So part of the domain XML file is actually defined in the server groups here, server group, dev group here, for example. That actually will specify the profile and the socket binding groups. So the definition of server groups typically in the domain XML file. In the host XML file, it defines the server and then which group is actually going to be associated with. So server definition will be in the host XML file. Group definition is a central to your domain, so that will be in the domain XML file. So here this particular server here, dev server 1, actually using this JVM name default. Even though if I don't specify the tag in here, automatically it will use this JVM default setting. So I'll just kind of put it explicitly here. But you have another server name production server A, and they actually belong to a group, production group. In the domain XML file, we actually do have a server group name production group associated with the HA profile. And it actually going to use this JVM name host2 JVM, which is defined here in the host XML file, is using that JVM. And then a socket binding group, HA socket, and port offset 300. So when you're running multiple server, the dev server 1 by default is going to use the standard ports. And then whether it's a standard socket or HA socket, pretty much they actually use the standard ports. So where, for example, HTTP port is port 8080, so dev server 1 is going to use that. So when you're starting another server, actually going to use a different port set. So you have to use the port offset parameter, putting 300. That means that actually increment every predefined ports by 300. So if it's HTTP port 8080, it'll increment by 300, 8380. So that will be the offset. That'll be the offset will be used for all the default port binding. So production server for HTTP listening on 8380, dev server 1 listen on 8080. So these are the kind of information you will find in the host XML file. So that concludes the host XML file. So take a look at the quiz in here. Part of the material you will find a quiz, and try to answer those questions by looking at that XML file there. So that's conclude the host controller.